process, which is actually quite important in terms of doing something before it gets very expensive for society, and reduce the research costs. Okay, so how is that possible? So, there's been a lot of advances in AI thanks to machine learning, and biotechnology and medical data have progressed to a point where machine learning can really be transformative. So, in terms of the cost structure, machine learning is more and more making it possible to reduce the costs. But the way that we're thinking about this, if there were government incentives, there would be also many more players, biotech startups, AI startups, academics, who could come and participate in the needed innovation effort. And it would make it possible to augment the R&D that is done in areas that are less profitable but really important for society. In terms of the research itself, in terms of the drug discovery pipeline, what recent years and the development of machine learning currently is really making clear is that it can accelerate the development. The biotechnology methods, for example, are making it possible to collect very large quantities of data, and they need to be analyzed with computers. In addition, they can diversify the set of drugs that will be tested in clinical trials, thus reducing the financial and health risks of these trials. And they make it possible, as we move further into the future, to develop more personalized medicine that depend on the particular, for example, genetic makeup of a patient. So we think that this is really important to bring about more equitable, accessible, and impactful healthcare. Now, machine learning already has had quite a few successes, but I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe many of you already heard about AlphaFold, which was developed by DeepMind, that makes it possible to, with deep learning and attention mechanisms, to map the sequence associated with the protein to its 3D structure, at least the dominant 3D structure. And this is really a tool that is being used more and more in biology, and more development of that kind is happening as we're speaking by many other groups. Now, more specifically on the front of actually developing new drugs, machine learning is being used more and more in many university labs. For example, at MIT, a group discovered halicin, which is the first gram-negative antibiotic in decades. And it's an interesting novel design based on antibiotic peptides. There's also been a lot of work on the genomic side, for example, to understand the relationship between one person's genes and disease. And finally, the kind of work, for example, in my group we've been doing is how we can use machine learning to really accelerate the discovery of new molecules in interaction with the wet lab cycle of experiments and analysis, which is called the lab in the loop. So here actually is this loop, right? We do lots of experiments with many potential drugs, and we accumulate data. Then we can use machine learning to analyze that data and model it. And the kinds of models that are really interesting here for scientific discovery are models that entertain multiple hypotheses. So we are generating explanatory hypotheses about potential discoveries, potential drugs. And then we can use other machine learning methodologies in order to perform what's called experimental design. In other words, what experiment, what next drugs should we try in order to acquire as much useful information as possible, for example, using methods derived from reinforcement learning. And then, of course, we get experimentation, where, again, actually, there's more and more machine learning being used in some of the techniques like robotics to efficiently acquire data. Okay, so in addition to doing something important about the medical problems themselves, if governments were to invest in these directions that involve biotechnology and AI and in general the pipeline of drug development, they would boost sectors of the economy that are much broader than those that would be directly funded. So expertise in AI and biotechnology would help the economic sectors with startups, small and medium enterprises to develop a high growth area with applications both for public health that we are interested in here, but also more broadly in areas of current commercial value. And this involves, very strong expertise. So this would lead to high skilled job creation in the countries that choose to go forward. All right, let me move on because I'm speaking too slowly, I guess. Now, as governments are going to be investing in these areas and already starting to do that, I think it is important that they realize that they have a leverage to make sure that the public money used in these directions of development of new drugs for public health purposes be applied in a way that's the best possibly aligned with public health goals. And for example, by encouraging or even forcing the companies involved to share the kind of data they produce to really make sure that the work is addressing the needs of public health, to bring together multiple actors, including internationally, to make this whole thing more efficient. So of all the infectious disease problems, we've spent a lot of time discussing about antimicrobial resistance because this is maybe the biggest threat that we see forward in terms of infectious diseases. Right now, there are already a number of bacteria, for example, that have become resistant to all the drugs that we have. And we're just lucky that they're not that virulent. Otherwise, we would have a huge problem on our hands. But they could mutate from one day to the next to something that we can't deal with. So it's really urgent that we do something about this. There's already around, by 2018, 1.2 million people dying every year because of these pathogens for which we don't have any drugs. And it's going to grow worse. It's predicted it's going to be around 10 million deaths per year. So that's comparable or probably more than COVID-19 by 2050. And it's growing slowly and steadily. And the cost of that is growing as well. So it's projected that the accumulated loss for the global economy might be around 100 trillion US dollars by 2050. Now, you might ask, if it's worth so much for society, why is it that there isn't so much industrial research? And there is a market failure. There's a complicated situation that makes it that I don't have to explain right now, but that makes it not sufficiently profitable for companies to get into this. But governments could really change that in various ways, and this is what we are asking them to prioritize. And there's already been international recognition that this was a major global challenge, with governments having made it a priority. But actually, in terms of action, I think we still need to see more of that. So to close, I think an important question is, how would an international coalition working towards those goals be organized? So there's a question of funding, which probably would need multiple countries and funders getting together. Should it be a very centralized system, or should it be very decentralized? It would be really important to have at least one global health organization involved to coordinate these efforts. As I said, I think the role of AI scientists here is important. And they may not have the expertise in biotechnology, but they can really help with the algorithms and the techniques that could be used to accelerate this research. It's going to be also important that biotech firms are involved, and finally, pharma companies. So I think this is the kind of question we want to discuss. Like, how do we make this happen? What kind of model could be used as an example to make these sorts of international efforts successful? How centralized or decentralized should it be, right? So this brings us to the discussion period.
Thank you so much, Joshua. So as you can tell, this is a very, this is an area that we've been thinking a lot about, and we've been considering all of the ways that we can better embed AI tools and methods within the current drug discovery ecosystem. And as Joshua showed in the last slide, we envision this being sort of a federated model, one in which we engage academics, biotechs, pharma companies as well, all throughout the drug discovery pipeline, and find meaningful ways to include AI throughout that pipeline. So our questions are really around how we can incentivize each of these respective players to become involved in this type of model. And we know that the people here represent all sorts of sectors and industries and come from all different parts of the world. And our goal today is to have a deeper understanding of, from your experience, what incentives could be most useful in this context, where you think there is the most potential to get these partners to engage together on an AI-driven drug discovery model. So with that, I will start with our first question, which is basically, do you find this proposal interesting from the vantage point of your industry, sector, or company? We know that biotechs and academics and large pharma companies all have very different incentive structures. But we're wondering whether there is sufficient interest from your particular perspective in engaging in a federated AI drug discovery model. So with that, maybe I'll open it up to the floor. And even first impressions about this work as well would be more than welcome. Thank you. Yeah, exactly.
So I think after 3 years in the pandemic, I think it's pretty clear it would be interesting to everybody and to benefit everybody. But the most important area that I found interesting was the focus on trying to figure out a business model that will allow us to finance that, because we've seen lots of medical technologies. I'm from Canada, and in Canada, I've seen a lot of failures because you can't change the status quo. So I found it very interesting that part of looking at how AI can change medicine is focused around how we can change the industry to allow it to be profitable, to allow it to grow on its own, because in the past that's been difficult. So for me, I thought that was very interesting. Pass it around.
Yeah, exactly. To your left. No, I think that that's a really great point. It's something we recognize as work that's not being done in the status quo. With the current drug discovery ecosystem, the incentives are fairly skewed towards areas of research that are most profitable, to the detriment of other areas of research where, predominantly diseases within lower and middle income countries, but also diseases here that are being under investigated. And what we anticipate is by initiating this work through grants and other, financial incentives, both through push and pull mechanisms, we can start seeing the types of AI research or AI-fueled research and development that we're looking to see, but that hopefully long-term it'll start becoming more profitable as part of a more status quo drug development ecosystem. So maybe someone could also speak to, or you're welcome to sort of follow up and speak to your experience with government investment in this area or government spearheaded innovation.
Yeah, I would like to add to that point, because one of the things I felt is that obviously in Canada we have a great system for helping get things started. But I have found, being back in Canada for a while, that that's clearly not enough. It's very good to get things started, not so good to get them continued. So I always like to say you can't create Google in Canada. So one of the challenges with medicine is it's a double challenge, because it's funded essentially by a government organization.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore the funding, I shouldn't say funding, the purchasing of goods is limited and controlled.
Mm-hmm.
So it just came to mind that the best kind of funding could be the purchasing of goods, not the traditional Canadian funding that we have. So
Yeah.
funding the purchasing and expansion of goods.
Right.
I think you need both, because you need that research to get off the ground, but you also need the pull incentive. So the pull incentive is procurement by governmental organizations or medical, like hospitals. And why is it not working right now? Like, they do buy drugs, these organizations, from pharma and biotechs, but it's not working for antibiotics and other antimicrobials because doctors are not using the new antibiotics if they can for good reason, because the more you use a drug, the more mutations happen that are going to eventually make those pathogens resistant to the drug. So as a consequence, the number of sales of the drug remains pretty low, unless, of course, it becomes a pandemic, but then it's too late. Like, we want to stop this before it's too late. And so in the recent past, the companies in the pharma industry that have commercialized antibiotics have actually lost money. They were not able to sell in sufficient volume. So what's the solution? So there's a good example in the UK where they've signed procurement contracts that say if you give us if you make available to our population, say, an antibiotic that we think is needed, then we'll pay you a constant price, which doesn't depend on how many are actually used. It's like an insurance policy in case this becomes a public health issue. We have those drugs, but we need to have them before it becomes a big issue, because it takes, as we've seen with COVID-19, it can take a lot of time to develop those drugs, and we were lucky that actually it went pretty fast there. But the usual like drug discovery process is much longer. Actually, it can be easily many years, sometimes a decade. So you need to do these ahead of time. So I think governments can act on both ends.
Mm-hmm. I think we have another comment. Yes, from Deepak.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, everyone. I'm a practicing physician in Canada as well, and I have to say that there's two things that are particularly interesting. Number one is, of course, the rapidity with which we can now develop new drugs, as proven in the situation of COVID-19, and I think this transformation is going to substantially change the economics of drug delivery and drug development. So I think that's one piece that I find I love this proposal because of that. I think that's a huge step forward. I share this slide all the time in a bunch of talks that I do, but basically I love your idea of taking the lab and putting it into the computer, and that's pretty much what I think we will be doing. I look at chemistry majors now and PhDs in chemistry that we work with, and they learn to code now. They don't really learn how to pipette or pull things together. They're working on computers. So I do think this is the future. I do think that it does require governments to start thinking about this seriously. Joshua, I don't know if you know this, but in Canada, there is a new network that we've set up, and maybe for other representatives of government here. It's called the Can Health Network. It's been funded by the federal government. It's something that myself and one other physician are leading right now, and it is a program that integrates all of the health systems in the country together into one common procurement platform. And this is to stimulate growth of small and medium-sized companies in Canada, and then obviously internationally. So it is, if a health system wants to work with a particular form of innovation, they get funded to do so, and then they get funded to procure, and then that procurement becomes a national procurement. So for all systems that are on the network. It doesn't exist much in Quebec right now, but everywhere else in the country, we have almost every other health system on the platform right now. So that would be something. I think I love your idea about the guaranteed minimum. I think that's an awesome idea and something that we should definitely bring up. But if I were looking at this from the perspective of rewinding a bit, I have to say right at the beginning that this work on drug development, I think, is going to be completely transformational to our delivery of healthcare anywhere. And the scale with which we can do it is going to be largely dependent upon the amount of funding that we can get into this without having to worry about, like you said at the beginning, without having to worry about getting money in return. And that is a really tough business model to crack, like Ron was just saying, really, really tough. And the only way that happens is by funding from governments, but it's also, as you can see with AlphaFold, also a huge contributing factor is compute, which talking to the god of computers here, so what the hell do I know, right? But really, the compute factor, it's expensive, right? Really expensive to do this work, and someone has to pay for it. So I wonder whether looping in the Microsofts or Googles of the world is also another option to make sure that we round out the ask.
Yes, so there is interest from these companies actually in these areas, but I mean they're not pharma, right? So I think they can contribute to development of new AI methods applied in these areas. I know that Microsoft in particular has a lot of work going in there. And of course, DeepMind, which is associated with Google, and they created a new startup that is focusing completely on this. So that's good. But I think we need the bigger buckets, which are the governments. If you add up the governments, of at least the OECD countries, let's say, that's something that needs to come in the equation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh, we have another comment.
Hi, Asha. It's Joanna Bryson. I just wanted actually to follow up from the previous to say quickly that I think the matter of having adequate revenue derived from transnational digital corporations is a separate second problem. I totally agree with what Joshua just said. You need governments to defend their citizens. That's not the business of companies, but it is the business of companies to be paying for the infrastructure in general by paying adequate tax. And so I would love to see, as a separate project, discussions about what is happening in transnational taxes and the digital involvement of this. And AI is a special case of that.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
I think another part, just quickly touching on the cost and government incentives, another aspect of this that we want to put forward is that this is strategic also from a government perspective. We anticipate if this work is not done, it costing billions of dollars by the year 2050 in terms of financial loss.
Billions in Canada, multiplied by
in Canada. Oh, there you go, even more so. Not to mention the millions of lives lost as well. So it's a question of how we also have sort of governments that tend to be short-term time oriented to internalize some of these long-term costs that ultimately are much bigger than the investment that they would be making at the outset. I think there's another comment. Perfect.
Yeah, so going into that first comment on the vantage point of industry and the academic world for that matter, Steve McKinnon, Cyclica from Canada, Toronto. In Toronto, we went through the original SARS back in 2003, and following that event and that, let's say, near miss of a pandemic, there was a lot of research money that actually went into studying coronaviruses in general. So a lot of researchers in the area, got funding, did a lot of structural biology research. A lot of this research ended up benefiting later on, years down the road, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. But at the same time, after a few years, that just kind of dried up. right? So, by 2008, 2009, I think it was already out of mind. It was 6 years ago, it was a near miss. But the reality is in biology, there's a lot of areas of pathogens that have a lot of commonalities between them, right? So we don't know which one is going to be the absolute next. We don't know that it's going to be, COVID-28 or, an Ebola virus next or anything else which is actually going to be the specific one. So it's almost like a gambling, and that kind of goes into the incentive structure of it all, is you could go and you could potentially develop an arsenal of general or broad spectrum COVID drugs, for instance, as a readiness measure, just in case that next major one is going to be a coronavirus. But we don't know that it will be, right? So it almost becomes like a gamble to have, that kind of broad spectrum coronavirus or that broad spectrum influenza. Other ones right now that are coming in, the respiratory illness in Ontario right now. So I think when we're thinking about global, right, what we could do globally that we can't necessarily do as individual countries. I think part of organizing should be going around and delegating that certain areas have certain focuses, right? So it might be very difficult to put stakes in the ground in absolutely every part of infectious diseases, but to have certain regional areas that are getting the drugs ready for a future Ebola or future this or future that. Because if we look over the last 20 years, there were plenty of them, right? Like there were plenty of near misses. We had the H1N1 in 2008 timeframe. There was a Zika virus and an Ebola in the mid-2010s, right? So these do come up periodically. I think a matter of global organization, at least in the public sector and academic sector, could be areas of focus within infectious disease.
I think this is a great idea, but I would add something that could help us in this challenge that you're naming. And that is the fact that a lot of the innovations that need to happen are likely to be applicable across the board for many infectious diseases. So including the AI innovations, but also a lot of the biotech sort of advances. And also the fundamental biology advances that AI can help us with. So for example, better understanding of the gene regulatory network of the human cells that are going to be infected, or of the pathogens, if it's bacteria, so that we can more quickly find the drugs if there is a new virus that comes up. And then there's another aspect which can help before the deadly mutations happen, which is related to better understanding of those mutations. Like how do they, what are going to be the mutations that we should be afraid of? And that can really benefit from the kind of modeling that is becoming more and more common with combinations of genomics, AI, and biotechnology.
Yeah, I would also say it's a really interesting point, but also allows us to get into a deeper conversation about, well, are we developing artificial intelligence for very specific applications of drug research, or are we developing AI applications that are more broadly applicable across a spectrum of diseases? And I would argue that the approach that we're taking is looking at all of the ways in which AI can be applied in those more sort of across the board generic applications throughout a drug discovery pipeline, so that the model we're developing can be reused and recycled in different contexts and different types of disease research. So while I think it would be quite interesting to have a model that, federates out across the world different particular areas of drug research, another aspect of what we're doing is creating something that is as generalizable as possible throughout a variety of drug discovery pipelines. Okay. There is another point. Perfect.
Hi, Alex I from Montreal. It would be lovely to hear someone not from Canada, otherwise it felt we all did 14 hours of flying to have a conversation we've had in Montreal, but yeah. Just to go back to the incentive question, so I love the point on we need to increase the pull incentive, and absolutely. I talk maybe as someone who works a lot with clients on getting money for projects from government grants and so on, so more on the push measure. Many of the funding mechanisms we have to support industrial AI research are maybe poorly adapted to the life science and drug discovery space. So it's short-term money by the stance of drug discovery. It's very much on a tech timeline. So, 9-month project, 15-month project, which is very, very short for a startup which is trying to innovate in the field of drug discovery. And there is substantial complexity. And anyone who's worked in the grant system in Canada knows this, like you have to do so many hours to get this amount of money. So anything we could do to readapt the funding system to help these young startups not have to attach themselves to so much VC money, but be able to get support in the direction of these less profitable drugs, I think would be wonderful at sort of helping this happen. Hopefully one day maybe.
That's a really good point. Any reactions to that?
Well, I'd like to add another issue, which is that a lot of the government funding in many countries, including Canada, for industrial research is based on the idea that the government doesn't need to take a very careful look at whether those projects are really interesting or not, because they rely on the fact that the companies are putting, let's say, half of the money, half of the cost on the table. And so they presumably have an incentive to choose well what they're going to be working on. But that doesn't work for things like AMR, where there might not be enough of a pool yet, at least, to motivate those companies. So I think, and also the other reason why it might not be the right model is that the government has finite amount of money to invest, and I think so the government should be strategic in deciding, okay, so we have these issues that we really want to address, and we're going to focus on them, rather than just spreading the money across the board, which is currently what typically is going on.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that we were exploring as a pull mechanism would be incentivizing the creation of data sets that are then used by other partners in the drug discovery ecosystem by providing the initial data creator with certain royalties or other financial benefits that might come from having been involved in the development of a successful drug, for example. Because just to sort of take a step back, but another big piece of our work has been government enabling this research not just through funding, but also by creating incentives to share data and to share scientific methods. So that might be another approach for providing a pull mechanism by incentivizing and financially rewarding the data sets that are then developed through new rights. We met with a lawyer who talked about how this would be sort of a sui generis net new set of legal rights that one would have associated with the data set that they had newly developed. So that might also be an interesting way to incentivize this work. So I might jump to the third question, which is, what would success look like from your perspective? Could success be measured in the short term? What would it look like in the short term? What would it look like in the medium term and the long term? Yeah.
Yes, hi, thank you. My name is Tahir. I'm from the Embassy of Pakistan in Tokyo. First of all, excuse my limited access to the subject's knowledge. So it's just a layman comment or a question. So as most of you must know, that recently we faced this devastated flooding in Pakistan. We used to have this dengue season every year in Pakistan, but because of this flood water, which is there on 1/3 part of the country, and so there is an emergency of dengue. So as this emergency came up, so we started looking at the solutions. So being here in Tokyo, we tried to approach Japanese pharmaceutical companies and other companies to see if there is a solution. So we came to know that there's a Japanese company which has successfully developed a vaccine for dengue, and but because dengue fever is not in Japan, so they were experimenting it in some other country, and their manufacturing facility was already ready, and then they were in Europe getting some licenses. So for the past more than 2 months, I've been trying to see how there is a solution and there is a problem, and people are dying because of that problem, babies and children in those camps. But there is a lot of documentation that that particular company has to go through before offering it as a solution, though it has been tested and a lot of publications have been there. So my layman question would be that this federating model that you're suggesting, will this make such kind of emergency access to a possible solution easier, or does it have a link? Thank you.
This is a great question. And I think to some extent reveals sort of a weakness in our own model, in the sense that, at least personally, I don't know that we've familiarized ourselves very much with all of the challenges in transposing a drug from one country to another. Our hope is in partnering with specifically international health organizations who are looking to create drugs that are available to those in a wide variety of countries, that we would be able to benefit from their knowledge of this space and how to transfer drugs from one context to another, and dealing with all of the legal and regulatory challenges that that might entail. But I'm not sure we have a good answer to that question. Do we?
Well, one thing I'd like to mention is that it is Pakistan's privilege to decide whether or not to accept a particular drug to be used and sold in the country. So that, you know, the Pakistani government could decide to make an exception to the usual rules to bypass some of the tests that would normally occur. They're meant to protect the public, by the way. So I don't understand where the block is. I guess it must be on the side of the manufacturing. Is that it?
Yes, they are yet not been permitted to sell the product which they are already manufacturing. So, yeah. So
If they sell it in
so
Pakistan,
because
then it's Pakistan's law.
it's a Japanese company manufacturing in another country and getting license from another region. So it's I think
So they have to wait to get
regulations.
license from that region.
So yeah, so I'm not sure like why they are not getting a license, but still, it's interesting that even though from where they are trying to get a license, the license is due maybe in a week or so, but still they cannot commit its supply to a third country yet. So so there are maybe a lot of So moving on with such a global initiative that your team is working on, so I'm sure must be working on it, but a common basic regulatory mechanism, especially considering emergencies, could have a benefit and impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's the benefit of having this be internationally funded as well. Initially, we had drawn up a series of recommendations that were specific to one particular country on how to enable drug discovery within their particular context, but we did transition to having this be more of an international model where countries around the world would join together in a sort of consortium around the development of certain drugs, the benefit of which being exactly what you're highlighting is sort of a shared regulatory approach or a shared understanding of the regulatory landscape that would allow those drugs to be used in each of those respective countries. But it's an important question. The other thing I want to mention about the benefit of AI in the drug discovery context, and I know Elliot can speak to this more, but is you can actually program within, as you're sort of searching through the molecular space, looking for drug candidates that are particularly good at being transported over long distances and looking for certain temperatures that they can be stored at. And that also allows AI to play an important role in international distribution of drugs as well. Elliot, I don't know if you want to chime in on that point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, this whole discussion around access is, I mean, I think I'll just say this is extremely challenging and perhaps a bit beyond the scope of scientists to talk about. This becomes more, it just speaks to why having a partnership with a global health organization would be so critical, and issues like equitable access to outputs of research are something that's very high on their agenda, and thus would have to be very high on this project's agenda as well.
Thank you. All right, does anyone else want to weigh in on the question of what success looks like before we move to the next question? Perfect.
Sorry, I'm just going to bring up one more point here, and that is that I think, to pick up on the conversation that's happening in Pakistan, when you look at this regulatory framework, there's a question of what I call impedance matching, right? Where you have this amazing rapidity with which things can be developed in a lab. Mm-hmm. And then there is this, it's like the train all of a sudden just comes to a grinding halt, right? When it comes to clinical trials. And then from clinical trials, you go to regulatory, and then from regulatory. So there is a long tail here that is really, really important not to forget in this proposal that you're making, mm-hmm. because that long tail will kill this, right? And so getting all the great work happening on the AI side at the front, which is getting the science right, getting the data sets right, et cetera, that's a phenomenal multi-country collaboration. But if we can't fund the clinical trials, because that's where the huge expense comes in, right? Mm-hmm. The massive expense for these pharmaceutical companies is these clinical trials. So generating the algorithms to build the drugs that show that the drugs might work in a virtual environment, some chemical simulations or computer simulations that you do, then taking that, manufacturing the drug and putting it into something or someone, right? First something and then someone, is hugely expensive. So the governments have to make sure that you don't just kill this thing because you don't have the follow-on funding to support the clinical trial work. Because a pharma company, like you said, Joshua, is not going to do this, right? They're gonna look at this and go, I'd much rather spend my time on atherosclerosis or cardiac disease or diabetes or any of these other things than antimicrobial resistance, because of the uptake of the health systems to actually pay money to buy these drugs. So I think that please make sure that when you do this, you really seriously think about the long tail there and make sure that it gets funded as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great point, and we actually do have an outline of the entire drug discovery pipeline and ways that AI can be embedded within it at each stage, even at late stage deployment, including with surveillance. But it is important that we make sure that governments that are investing we retain that investment throughout the entire process, which can be quite lengthy, as you've said. All right. I might quickly transition. I know we don't have much time left.
I mean, that was already the roadblock question, I think. That was the number 4.
Yes, which is a great segue. Are there other roadblocks that anyone else wants to raise in terms of things we should be anticipating as creating challenges for this solution within the international community, but even within the industry that you find yourself in that you want to raise? Perfect.
Hi, everyone. The team that I'm in attendance with today is not directly related to healthcare, but we create tools that help assess an AI model's performance or conformity to standards. So forgive if this is maybe somewhat of a naive software engineer perspective in this sector. But judging by our experience with health-related clients, it's really interesting how the biggest roadblock from a practical perspective of creating a model or testing it is just getting the data. Garbage in, garbage out is a given, but just getting to test a model, getting all of the data from different hospitals, countries, making sure all the regulations of crossing borders for data is a huge issue that we see for in our experience. And while locally in Japan, there is some movement to create common infrastructure like a My Number system, which is possible in a socialized healthcare, and they collect patients' data in kind of a central data bank, so to speak. It's still unclear whether it will be accessible to industry at some point, and specifically smaller scale companies that might be more flexible and able to invest in AI. And it's primarily major players, both medical research companies and just big companies in general, that can team up and ooze some data out of hospitals on a case-by-case basis and create some kind of AI model. So yes, from a practical perspective, it's we are kind of looking at this space and looking for solutions that might enable sharing data, or at least ensuring data security, patient's privacy, consent, all of these things that will actually go into making these innovative health models. I'm not entirely sure how it works in context of drug discovery. Maybe you don't need patient's data, you need more chemical data, for example. But yes, this is kind of an industry perspective, so to speak. Thank you.
I think that's a really great point, and rightly identified as a challenge, a major roadblock if we're not able to do it successfully. There is some healthcare data, as you've said, which is more, I guess, less sensitive. It's associated with navigating the chemical and biological space. But of course, there's plenty of data that's also incredibly sensitive, especially as you're talking about AI's potential for personalized medicine. And so we've been investigating some of the promising areas of research around protecting data privacy, but still facilitating data sharing using techniques like differential privacy, encryption techniques as well. But they're still in their relative infancy, I want to say, so it's hard to rely on them as being, ways of completely mitigating the risk in their entirety. So, a really important point from the technical perspective. I don't know if anyone wants to weigh in on our end, but something that we will definitely note and we're continuing to investigate. All right, I know we're running, we have 1 minute left. Really low on time. I think this has been a really high quality conversation. This is exactly the type of feedback that we're looking to get as we build out a framework for what a pilot project in this space could look like. So I would invite everyone here that's interested in remaining involved in the conversation to stay in touch. We have a whole list of questions much longer than this that we would love to ask, but unfortunately we just don't have the time. So if this is of interest, please come see me at some point during the conference, and we'll be sure to connect and make sure that this conversation can be ongoing. All right. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Joshua or Elliot?
Oh, thanks for everyone for the great discussion.
Yes, many thanks.